As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Another special episode, as today we are joined by royalty, guys. Royalty. None other than the king of Muslim Twitter, Asad. Welcome to the Malcolm Effect.
Come on, bro. You did not have to introduce me that way. Oh my God. No.
Welcome to the Malcolm Effect. How are you?
You've taken my throne, bro.
Never.
I've been dethroned.
Never.
Not
I'm
allowed.
not even in that scene anymore. But no, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a long time coming. Seriously. Fun fact, guys. I actually have to attribute a lot of my intellectual trajectory to Asad, actually. And I'll tell you why. Because he added me to a Twitter group. The name of the group I will not say publicly. It was about, I think, maybe 2. Are we going on 2 years now?
It's been 2 full years, yes, at least.
Yes. And I remember being on that group. Asad was talking about like Marxism and material analysis, and in the ways in which we understand race. And I'm just thinking, I had I'm there scratching my head, thinking, what the hell is this guy talking about? Because seriously, because I did not have that honestly that depth to understanding race, having a structural analysis and a material analysis of race. I didn't have that understanding until, and then I remember asking Asad. He so kindly broke down things to me, introduced me to a lot of key concepts, and essentially planted the seeds, I would say, literally, for my intellectual trajectory. So thank you very much for that, bro.
Of course, man, and I'm grateful to be in community with you, and grateful to have the opportunity to learn with you. And it seems in many ways you've transcended. Yeah, So I'm looking forward to having the discussion about how since those 2 years your own intellectual trajectory has evolved. I know you spent some time. Are you calling me from Cairo? I don't even know.
No, I'm back in the UK, actually.
Back in the UK, right? You guys got the football matches going on right now.
Coming home. It's coming home.
It's coming home. It's coming home. I'll put aside my American patriotism and
100%. I told everyone, no theory, just vibes. I am pausing any critique of empire until it comes home.
Yeah, until it comes home. And then it's back on the grind. It's back on the grind.
Exactly.
But yeah, thank you for having me, Mamadou. When you first joined, quote unquote, the Twitter world, it was, it still is quite a mess, but I guess maybe less so now than it was.
It's the ghetto, but we love it.
It's better. Yeah. For me, it was like, okay, this guy has traditional Islamic training, right, in the seminaries of Egypt, or is going through the training, right? But is like you're not like weird, right? Like you're normal. You know what I'm saying? Like, and that to me, is, as sad as it sounds, it's like actually quite refreshing, right? And so I was grateful that you were willing to tolerate my abstract theoretical commentary on all of the issues that you mentioned. And I've been rethinking through a lot of that stuff myself, particularly I just finished a graduate degree
at Columbia.
Yeah, yes sir. And so thinking about how that stuff, the stuff that you and I spend so much time of our day reading, how does it really apply in real life, and how do we bring that to to the people, and how can we learn from the people, right? Because like if we spend all this time in the ivory tower and we think we know it all, right? Because we've learned the theories, that actually is it's going to stunt our own growth, right? Because we're not going to be willing to listen to others who don't have, quote unquote, the pedigree, right?
Yeah.
And so like ever since I've sort of removed myself from that academic setting, I'm engaging once more with what one might call the real world, and refining some of my own, I guess, talking points or ideas. And it's been really refreshing.
So talk about that a bit more. So you've spent how many years in graduate school,
Sure.
speaking about theory, speaking about learning theory, sorry, then we're talking about again a structural analysis. And I think just for maybe our listeners, I think by now people will understand what I mean by structural analysis. But you want to go for a definition, a very basic one, Asad?
Yeah. Structural analysis, right, of politics, of history, of so on and so forth, basically examines how, you know, certain, I guess, social and political trends are
Mm-hmm.
not a result of individual or interpersonal
Mm-hmm.
attitudes, but a result of deeply embedded historical policies and systems. Right. When we talk about white supremacy, we're not talking about, we're not just talking about someone saying something racist to you on the bus, right?
Exactly.
We're talking about a system that scholars have traced, depending on who you ask, anywhere between 400 to 600 years. Some people trace it to 1619, some will trace it to 1492. It all depends on what metric you adopt. But the idea is that these are macro systems that have been in place for a very long time, and their residual effects are felt on a
Yes.
day-to-day basis, right? In policy, in healthcare, in education, in employment, in housing, and so on and so forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, having studied, so, just to give the listeners a background, I was born and raised in Brooklyn, been, a lifelong New Yorker my whole life. My background, my undergraduate degree is actually in social work, and I'm trained professionally as a community organizer. So I've taught it in community settings like schools and
Mm.
nonprofits and whatnot on issues related to surveillance, police brutality, gentrification. In another life, I sued the cops. Maybe we can talk about that.
Yep.
And so a lot of a lot of the stuff that we talk about in the academies are things that I've been directly exposed to.
Mm-hmm.
And getting my graduate degree, my master's degree in Islamic studies from Columbia, really gave me the theoretical scaffolding I needed to understand some of my real world experiences. So I got my degree in Islamic studies. My thesis was on Muhammad Iqbal as a decolonial thinker.
Mm-hmm.
So what I tried to do in my thesis was to canonize him, quote unquote, in a
Yeah.
similar way that we've canonized, Frantz Fanon and, Walter Benjamin and other thinkers of various schools of thought. And my intervention was basically to say, why can we not include, a Muslim, a consciously Muslim thinker and within the anti-colonial canon? And so that's what I tried to do
Mm.
in my thesis, right? To draw from Iqbal's ideas and say that, he actually made some astute observations about empire, right? From the perspective as a Muslim subject of that, like directly under, British colonial rule, who was also
Yeah.
educated in the West, right? He made some astute observations, and I think that's important for people who are in the work of anti-colonial analysis to look into. So
Mm.
that was my thesis, but of course a lot of it is like high theory stuff,
Yeah.
in terms of like stuff on the ground lately. Because of the pandemic, it's been really difficult to get involved community. But one of the nonprofit that I founded and that was surveilled many years ago by informants, Muslims Giving Back, NGB. We are working out of a community center here, and we recently invested in a hunger truck. So we've been going out and distributing food to undocumented and unhoused people for, I want to say 7 or 8 years, like way before
Wow.
like the mutual aid stuff became a hot topic. We were doing it long before people started talking about it in the pandemic. And so we just bought, I think about a year ago, through community investments, a $70,000 truck that we've customized that goes every day of the week to do, or at least during the height of the pandemic, every day of the week would what we do would build partnerships with local restaurants. We'd buy
Mm-hmm.
food from them in bulk, right? And then we would distribute that food to unhoused people in various communities. And
Wow.
usually on Saturday nights we go all out, where we go to Herald Square, which is 34th Street in Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan. We distribute food, we distribute hygiene products, women's products. We offer haircuts, so we have like barbers there, and this is like a weekly thing. So if any one of you are listening to this, go to thehungertruck.org. You could hit me up through Mamadou's contact, and
Yeah.
I can plug you into the work here in New York. We've also recently had our mayoral elections and other municipal elections. So we just elected a new mayor based on the ranked choice voting system, which some of you
Yeah.
may or may not be familiar with, right? The idea is that you don't get to choose one candidate, you can choose several, in fact, based on your preferences. So you can pick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the way it works is that, the first candidate, like you go through one round of voting, right? And the candidate with the lowest percentage is chopped out, and the others remain, and then you go to round 2. Same thing, the candidate with the lowest number of votes chopped out, and you keep going until someone hits 50% of all votes and they win the election.
Okay.
And so that way, like people have the opportunity to be a little bit strategic. You don't have to vote for one person, you can vote for others. And Mamadou and you and I will can also have a conversation about electoral politics, right? And
Definitely.
what purposes that serves. And I think there's an important distinction to make between hyper local electoral politics like city
Yeah.
council versus like president, right? Because like
Yes.
city council, right? If you're running for city council in New York, you're going to be answering to about 2,000-3,000 people maybe, in your community. And you're not going to oversee like foreign policy in Syria or something, right? You're
Exactly.
gonna you're gonna you're gonna oversee funding for schools, roads, parks, these sorts of amenities that everyday people in your community need in their everyday lives. And I think that's important. But yeah, so we had a mayoral election. It was it was wild. Our listeners might be familiar with Andrew Yang. He was the one who got the most sort of online coverage, but he obviously he lost. Literally the first night he dropped out when they started counting the votes. The other candidates were Eric Adams, Catherine Garcia, Maya Wiley, Scott Stringer. Just to give our listeners a quick overview. So Eric Adams is a former police officer. He was a formerly registered Republican. Yeah, so his whole story is that he grew up in Brooklyn, working class, black kid who was beat up by the police and decided to, the whole shtick, join the system to change it, right? Now here's the thing. Here's where it gets a little complicated. So the thing with Eric Adams is that he did this back in like the 80s and 90s
Hmm.
when like nobody was even willing to acknowledge the existence of police brutality against black people. So like in the 90s, his politics would have been considered radical because nobody was talking about it, right? Or at
Okay.
least at least in the context of New York politics. Like he would be on the front lines saying, that, police abuses against black people are the new lynching, right?
Okay.
Like these are things that radical activists say today, right? The
Yeah.
new Klan, right? Cops are the new Klan, right? These are things he was saying in the 90s when before there was social media, before there was any of this. So he's been riding the coattails of that, right? Into the modern era where we've become much more radicalized on police and we've become much more exposed to the severity and scale of police violence where like his views are now dated.
Okay.
But he is able to ride the coattails of his history, right? So like he can point to the old guard of the black and brown communities in New York and say like I've been with you guys since the 90s, since the 2000s. Now these are not communities that are active on Twitter, right? These are not
Yes.
typically not people who are reading Fanon or Lenin, right?
Hmm.
And Eric Adams, if there's one thing that he did right is that he knew how to communicate to them. Whereas the other candidates, all of whom were at least nominally to the left of him, struggled in this regard. You know, I feel like, and Mamadou, you and I have had this discussion, right? Like, as much as, we hate to admit it, delivery counts for something, right?
Absolutely.
Like
Absolutely.
that's not this. When I say delivery, I don't mean respectability politics. I think there's a difference between respectability politics, which should be condemned and which should be called out, but like speaking with clarity
Yeah.
to a community on their own terms, right? I think is if you're in the work of organizing, right? If
Hmm.
you're in the work of winning people over politically, right? You have to be able to do that, and it's going to take a lot more than slogans, right? And I felt like the progressive camp was too caught up in sloganeering and really failed to reach these communities. On top of
No,
that, a lot of
for real.
yeah. Sorry, you're gonna say something?
No, absolutely. I'm in agreement with you. And I think when I think about like platforms like my own podcast or my Instagram, it's the kind of impetus and constant kind of dragging or pulling force from what I'm trying to do is exactly that. How do I communicate effectively what I'm learning and what the theory says? Because again, I'm not going to go into certain spaces and quote certain texts and let's talk about this book and that book. That's not to say we have to infantilize like the populace. No, because I think people are just as intelligent as anyone else, if not more intelligent. I mean, having a certain level of having a degree doesn't denote your intelligence as such, or necessitate you're going to be more smarter than others, smarter than others. But I do say there is that kind of disconnect where sometimes people who are involved in progressive spaces, perhaps online, don't actually operate in the real world. And I feel
Yes.
time and time again, what we're seeing by the election results of Eric Adams, or for example, we in 2019, we obviously in the UK lost the election of Jeremy Corbyn, and the Conservative Party like gained an outright majority, one of the biggest majorities in a long time.
Jeez.
Again, and honestly, if you were to be in Twitter sphere, you would have thought it was going to be a landslide for the left.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's not to say I understand how algorithms work. I understand how, but there was this thing of, the left is winning, and you even today, for example, 75% of young people believe socialism is better than capitalism, and you hear all these things. But again, okay, that's what we are led to believe is the mood of the people, but how does that translate into electoral politics? It's quite opposite. I mean, right now we are reeling from the effects of Brexit. That was and the kind of and a reemergence of nationalism, and a reemergence of kind of this kind of bigging up of empire, and this kind of pride of or this kind of jingoism that we see. So again, I feel like people who are in progressive spaces, I think maybe there's like a disconnect. Sorry, no, there is a disconnect. Number one, and maybe number two, they're not spending time with the people they purport to represent.
Yeah. Though let me throw one wrench into this, right?
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example that sort of speaks to why it's so damn important just to like meet with people where they are. So, okay, Mayor Eric Adams wins the NYC's mayoral election. He won
Mm-hmm.
with black communities, he won with Latino
Mm-hmm.
communities, he won with Middle Eastern communities, he won with South Asian communities in the outer boroughs, which are basically the four boroughs outside of Manhattan, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people, the quote unquote anti woke crowd on Twitter, who are just as problematic and just as online, right? They say, look, this is a defeat for the defund movement. This is a defeat for the abolition movement. But now, let me tell you why that's wrong, right? Because many of the same people who voted for Eric Adams as mayor in their local district, they voted for city council candidates who were critical of the police, who wanted to take away funds from the police, who were progressive.
Mm-hmm.
Now, someone would hear that, like, how does that make sense? How do you vote for a progressive candidate in your local city council race, like in your neighborhood, right? But why you vote for the cop as mayor?
Mm-hmm.
Now, you and I might see that like
Yeah.
that makes no sense ideologically. But now that's the
Yeah.
problem is that most people don't vote on ideological puritanism. They vote
Yeah.
candidates whose names and faces they know and candidates who have shown up. The progressive candidates who won the city council district, they won because they showed the hell up, right?
Mm.
And not necessarily because they had the right leftist talking points, right? They
Mm-hmm.
won because they came to the local church or the local mosque, and they spoke to the people. They distributed food with the people. They showed up when there were bigoted attacks on communities of color.
Mm-hmm.
They became a known face, right? And so the conclusion I reached from this, and other more astute analysts of New York politics have also pointed to this. It's not, you can save the slogans for later. Speak
Yeah.
to the people, sit with the people.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are about defund, if you are about abolition, trust me, they will come to you. But first, you got to meet them,
Mm.
speak to them, and they will come to you, right? And this is what Eric Adams did, but in a cynical way, right? Because
Yes.
he's telling these black and brown communities that I come from working class background, I support working class. But you know what he's also doing? He's having backdoor meetings with developers, wealthy landlords, Wall Street, like very big property owners. These are the people who are going to price out our black and brown communities, right? So
Exactly.
he's playing that double game, right? So he can speak to like working class communities using their own tongue, but then he'll go back to these, the wealthy capital owning class, and he'll speak to them.
Just
And
just call me when we're gonna overthrow the bourgeoisie, man.
yeah, yeah, right. Like that's it, bro. He's probably, I might be wrong on this, but I have a strong suspicion that out of all the mayoral candidates, he's one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest among them. Dude owns like multiple properties. He's a landlord himself. He makes a salary in the hundreds, thousands. The guy is not, salt of the earth. At least not
Mm-hmm.
anymore. If he grew up that way, he's not part of that class now,
Yeah.
right? Like no matter how much he will try to claim it. And so what I'm seeing in New York, right, happening is that local city council districts are becoming more progressive, right?
Okay.
Our borough presidents, so every borough has a president. Many of them are also progressive.
Mm-hmm.
Our comptroller, so the comptroller is basically the guy who is the CFO of New York. He handles all the funding and the money of the city. He's
Mm-hmm.
also progressive. So what I anticipate seeing is that all of these progressive, positions, right? All these progressive, council members and comptrollers and borough presidents are going to clash with Eric Adams in City Hall,
Okay.
basically, right? In a similar way that, actually, no, I was going to say in a similar way that the Democrats clashed with Trump, but actually they didn't clash with him. They enabled him in many ways.
In
So
many ways, for real.
scratch that analogy. Local politics is my opinion is like local politics is actually much more interesting in many respects because of these things, right? Because you have a sense of, you feel like you have a sense of involvement and investment in it that you don't have in the
So
national scene. And yeah,
let,
please.
let's talk about like electoral politics then. My position is I do believe in voting. I do believe I did actually was on the side of, the likes of Angela Davis and Dr. Cornell and many others who joined as an anti-fascist vote. Me and you both spoke about this. Perhaps my shift from that today is I think it's just very important that, because again, if you're a thought leader, it's different to just telling someone to vote. If you're really about achieving like a radical change, we have to be clear in situating what the function of this vote is. In
Mm,
in the last election, the American election, the function of that vote was to stop, what they said, the proto-fascist. Absolutely. But again, let's not take our eyes off the ball. And I think it's very, I think as black people, time and time again, and Malcolm X said this, we're speaking about like, Malcolm, Republicans and Democrats and being wolves and foxes, and speaking about
mm,
liberals. I think it's very important because I'm not too sure if I'm sold on the idea if
mm.
all the voting power or all the effort for organizing is funneled behind Democratic Party. I'm not sure how viable that is anymore as a model.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
year and year, every 4 years, we have an election
Mm,
for less. And I mean, as Dr. Joy James so powerfully said that, Obama was the first black imperial president. He wasn't just the first black president; he was the first black imperial president. And I'm someone who wholeheartedly believes that America serves as presents itself as an imperial formation. It's an imperial empire for me, especially in its foreign policy, especially in we have a two-party system, this duopoly. But let's be honest, the majority of politicians are beholden to capital. So
mm.
and
Are
and
capital. They're not just beholden to it. They are.
I mean, they are capital in many respects. So so I think the option truly is you have like this full blown kind of white supremacist party that's very happy to literally rewrite history and uphold white domination and homogeny. And then you have another party that will, give some reform and maybe, yeah, perhaps just give some reform. And I think when it's put in those terms, of course, tell them, fine, we are voting for a party for reform. And to be fair, I spoke to Dr. Robin about it and I asked the same question, Robin D.G. Kelly. And he says, listen, voting and reform gives us breathing space. It gives us, because otherwise we're too focused on like, defeating this person, or we're being reactionary sometimes. Whereas when you're voting, so when you vote for certain parties that are going to deliver some reform, or maybe some relief, like and it's minuscule in comparison to what should be done, but okay, some relief. It gives us breathing space to recuperate, to reorganize, to reassess, and kind of be stronger in analysis. That I'm down for. What I'm not down for is kind of people presenting, and this happens by people I think on the left, maybe not as left as I am or left as I would like people to be, but some people will be like, oh, or try to talk about politics, electoral politics, as if that's going to bring about the revolution, or as if that's like a radical formation, which I don't think it is.
Yeah, no, I agree with probably all of what you said. I like to frame it in terms that, when you're voting, you're not voting for a party. You're voting essentially for the most ideal conditions under which you can organize. You are
Hmm.
essentially choosing your enemy, right?
Yes.
That's what a lot of organizers frame it as, right? You are choosing your opponent, or you're choosing your enemy, right? You're
Hmm.
choosing whom you're going to get to organize against. Whom can you
Yes.
push? Whom can you mount a resistance against, right? And Chomsky and Angela Davis, they've been in the game for half a century or more, right?
Hmm.
They've seen some of the worst depredations of empire that for you and I, in many ways are abstract. And
Yeah.
I think, you know, I, I saw some people like kind of writing them off or dismissing them, and I find that to be a little disrespectful, maybe, if that's, don't know if that's too strong of a word, but at the same time, I think the critique of electoralism is 100% valid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whoever's in that executive office is going to be the face of a system much larger than they are, right? Going back
Mm-hmm.
to the structural analysis, right? Whether it's Obama, Trump, Biden, what have you. And we're just choosing the face that is easiest for us to resist, right? Um,
Yes.
the thing, with electoralism is that another analogy I give is that of a dentist appointment, right? Voting in general, right, is like visiting the dentist.
Mm-hmm.
It's something you might do once every 6 months, right? Or in America, we barely have healthcare, so maybe once a year, right? But you're brushing your teeth every day, right? You're flossing every day, right? Ideally, and organizing and building community and doing mutual aid and having reading groups and all that stuff. That's like the daily brushing your teeth that you do,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then, you know, once in a while, right, you're going to go to the dentist, which is like, okay, now you're going to cast your vote. But that's not
Yeah.
where all the work is. The work is, in the day to day, right? We don't put our dependency on these systems, but we can see them as a vehicle towards one end. And, sometimes for some people's immediate needs, that can make a difference, right?
Yeah.
Biden's infrastructure plan, in my opinion, is very important for a lot of communities in terms of our transportation, in terms of having, actually, sadly, he's actually rolled back some of the provisions and the plan because of like conservative opposition, which is like effing terrible. But like, the stimulus checks, those help people pay bills. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Like my younger sister recently had a kid, and they're going to be sending stimulus checks out to people with young kids on a monthly
Yes.
basis, right? That stuff is important. For giving student rent, sorry, not student loans is important, right? Like if Biden clears student loans, well, guess what? You're going to have literally thousands of young people like myself who are able to actually do much more of the radical stuff that we've been trying to do, that we've been unable to do because of our debt, right? Like,
Yes.
so that stuff is, I think, important. And that stuff, I think, particularly as an American, right? I say this as an American, I have
Mm-hmm.
to hold my government to account. I have to I have to keep my government's feet to the fire, right? Without, like you said, thinking of it as like some sort of like revolutionary vanguard, because that's not going to happen. So I agree with that much. And locally, I would say that, particularly, I can speak only for the New York experience, but the New York experience is in many ways national news here in,
Yes.
in the US. Socialists have found a way to, really influence local politics, right? They
Mm-hmm.
found a way to make inroads into communities. I think that's very important, man, particularly when it comes to things like the police budget. So a lot of people don't know this, maybe outside of the US don't know this, is that the police budgets are municipal.
Mm-hmm.
They're local, right?
Yeah.
Biden has nothing to do with the NYPD's police budget. It has
Yes.
nothing to do with the Chicago PD's police budget. It has nothing to do. That stuff gets handled locally,
Mm-hmm.
and that stuff gets put to a vote in city council. Now
Mm-hmm.
imagine you have, in half of city council members are, pro defund or defund
Yes.
friendly, right? They can put a vote on slashing the police budget
Yes.
and reallocating that money elsewhere. That, I think, is, you know, screw the national politics stuff. The local stuff, I think, is really where, that change will happen, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
national is whatever, but when it comes to local elections, I'm a much more stronger advocate of being locally involved, and that's why I've been tweeting a lot about stuff that's been happening in New York, with like the city council races, because that's where our Marxist theory gets put into practice. That's where we actually can seize power and actually influence, where the money goes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where I've been at in terms of like putting my theory into practice. It's like supporting, these local initiatives and pushing for deeply rooted local communities and
Mm-hmm.
knowledge of local communities.
How do you find yourself in these leftist spaces? Do you find it frustrating? Do you find it? Because I mean, we had a brief conversation the other day. I think sometimes people, and this is not a critique. Like, I mean, this is a critique, but it's not an exclusive.
Hmm.
It's not an exclusive finding on
Sure.
people who are left identifying or left leaning. But many of the times I find people look for identity within these spaces as opposed to, you know, what that identity should represent. And what I mean by that is, it becomes more about putting a is it, do I even know what is it, what sign is it, what's the Soviet Union sign? Is it a flipping angst, or is it a hammer, or what?
Yeah, I think it's the hammer and sickle, some
Yeah,
form or another.
it's about putting that in your Twitter bio. It's about putting, I am this, I am a Marxist Leninist Maoist, I am this, I am identified as this. It's almost as if I'm creating spaces which are like clubs, like, kind
Yeah,
of
it's
theory clubs. And I
100%.
think,
Yeah.
and I don't know, I've just never been someone like that. Like, even within like Islamic stuff, I've never been someone who's like, oh, I must be with this camp of people, I must be with this kind of people. Yes, I think I can't lie, I do believe theory is important. And I do believe the ideological underpinnings of the group that of individuals is important, because I think it kind of allows us to understand where they're coming from. But I think sometimes that can be a hindrance in some spaces, where, especially at a time when the left is so weak and we're arguing over like, oh, I'm an anarchist, I'm this, I'm that. Like, I'm sorry, but who really cares? Like, what does that mean materially?
Yeah, yeah. Are you an anarcho-syndicalist or are you a communitarian? It's so. Look, you brought up the perfect analogy. Then I was going to bring it up. You and I grew up in a lot of these Islamic religious
Yes.
spaces, right? And you'll see if you go to Muslim Twitter, some people have in their bios, Ash'ari,
Yes.
Shafi'i, Shadhili, or Naqshbandi, right? Like, for our listeners, these are various schools of thought,
Yes.
schools of theology and jurisprudence and spirituality in the Islamic tradition. And a lot of people almost turn them into like little cliques or, cults, if you're being less generous.
Hmm.
And it's an ego boosting game, right? It's narcissistic. It's flexing. You're not doing anything right by positioning yourself in that way. You're maybe signaling to people that you've done your readings, right? Though
Yes.
I often find that people who are very quick to
They haven't.
right, right. People who are very quick to drop these terms actually haven't done their readings. But like, you're trying to signal to people that you're part of the in group. You know what I'm saying? But our job as people who want to mobilize communities, we don't want to create little factions and in groups, right? We want to create large
Exactly.
communities. We're not building a clique, we're not building a cult, we're building a community. Martin
Hmm.
Luther King Jr.'s beloved community, right? That happens not through getting the right sort of, terminologies and theoretical sort of concepts. I mean, like you said, that stuff is important to have a foundation, right?
Yes.
But like, I'm thinking about like going to my, my local masjid and being like, hey guys, are you guys anarcho-syndicalists or are you guys communitarians? Do you know your decolonial epistemology? Bro, like, they're gonna laugh at me, right? Because that's just not how you get people. That's not how you mobilize people, man. Like,
Exactly.
you know what I'm saying? Like, Cornell does a great job at this.
Yes.
Cornell, I have to hand it to him. Like, he publishes, articles with conservatives. Like, and he's uncompromised, and they know he's uncompromised. They know he won't, but he's willing to reach a hand out that far, which, according by some of our standards, he might even be too compromising in that respect. But you
Hmm.
know, he has the record behind him. He's done the work, right? He's really, 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 really putting himself out there and actually talking to people on their own terms. The guy's a proper philosopher, right?
Yes.
But you talk to him, you don't feel like you're talking to a philosopher, because most philosophers don't know how to talk to people. He knows how
Hmm.
to talk to people, right? He and Malcolm, hey, a Malcolm effect, right? Like, people like that, right? They're not theory, they are the embodiment of theory.
Exactly.
They actually live it out. They can convey the theory to you in their action, right?
Hmm.
I think that's what we ought to aspire to, right?
100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's something that I've said often. And I think I mean, the danger in that, and as is the case we've seen historically, is that when we have single movement leaders, which I think, to be honest, I think we're at a time and a juncture in history where we're no longer going to see kind of this single, or this movement led by single figures. But that's not to say that they can be, or should, I mean, there should be figures like Cornell, figures who are excellent communicators, figures that people, and I think ultimately, I know this is going to sound maybe a bit abstract, but I'm thinking of the companions who were with the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him,
Mm.
when, they would say that they felt in his presence that he loved us the most. And I
Mm.
feel that's very important. I mean, when you're with the people that you purport to be wishing to serve, do they feel loved by you? Because
Mm.
ultimately, and I think it's very, I mean, it can sound very hippie-ish or sound very like, oh, airy fairy, but I think it's very important. And I know I lack in that because I lack a lot of revolutionary patience. I'm trying to work on it, but I do try my best in terms of my immediate circle. And my immediate circle is not as in just my friends. I mean, people who I, you know, maybe organize with or try to share ideas with, or who I'm in community with. I definitely try and engender or that kind of environment of love of each other, because I feel like, again, when we think about movements, how many times have we seen, I mean, we can speak about you suing the police, you said that, informants and things like that. How can we like save our movements from being infiltrated and informed upon? You know what I mean? We can't even, that's one thing we have to think about, and let alone the external forces. But I feel like if we start engendering communities based on love and respect of each other, and not in the abstract, but as in like, as Dr. Cornel West says, that, justice and love, justice is what? What do you say? Justice is what
Love looks
ten-
in
love
practice.
likes in public, exactly.
Like, yeah.
And tenderness is what it feels like in private. And
Yes.
that's
Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
like the mantra that I'm kind of trying to be upon anyway and embody.
Yeah, you touched upon a lot of interesting and important points, right? Number one, the point about having horizontal leadership, right?
Yeah.
We don't have charismatic figures, or as many charismatic figures as we once had. I think that era
Hmm.
has run its course, and we probably now are going to see a much more decentralized sort of, revolutionary momentum, which
Hmm.
has its pros and cons, right? It's like
Yeah.
it opens up the space, right, for a lot of creativity, right? And some
Hmm.
people might say that it makes it harder to have like concrete goals. And so there's pros and cons to that. But I think overall, democratizing the revolutionary arena is crucial because we're not depending on a single individual, right? Um,
Exactly.
and that individual, if they happen to, if something happens to them, like they get assassinated or something like that, or even if they just let us down, right? The movement was not about them, right? And so there's that aspect of it, right? And then the other aspect you pointed to about rooting your praxis in love,
Hmm.
right? In love for the people. And you gave the perfect example of the prophet, upon him be peace, where like literally every person he spoke to was convinced that they were his best friend.
Exactly.
They were exclusively his best friend to the exclusion of others, right? Like,
Hmm.
you know, you think about that, right? Like, think about like the relationships that you have. Do you talk to every person that in your life that you engage with, right? Or at least within your friend circle, do you talk to them as if they are, you know, your best friend or someone whom you love, or at least do you extend to them that kind of love? You know what I'm
Hmm.
saying? Or that kind of generosity, right? Even in your debates and your arguments, you and I, we get into debates all the time, right? Like,
Hmm.
are we extending to each other that kind of love, or at least understanding of knowing that, this other guy, he's he has a different experience than me, and I'm coming to him with good faith, and I hope he comes to me with good faith, and I trust in
Yeah.
him, right? Even if we may part ways on some issues, I know where he's coming from. Like, are you extending that love to people in your life? And that's
Hmm.
something I ask myself, right? It's an important question to ask. I forgot you mentioned one more thing after that, but
The corner West quote, or
yeah, 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 yeah. you know, Someone actually said something very, very wise to me, on that
hmm
Cornel West quote. So this is from a brother named Sahib Sultan. He was a chaplain at Princeton,
mm,
a Muslim chaplain at Princeton, and he recently passed away. I think he had a terminal illness. I think it was cancer. I don't remember. But, may his soul rest in peace.
I mean,
He was reported to have said that justice without mercy can become violent, or can be
mm,
violence, right? And our tradition is not just a tradition of justice; it's also a tradition of mercy, right?
mhm,
When we talk about quote unquote killing the cop in your head, or thinking
yes,
outside of the carceral state, right? Not thinking, not thinking about punishment, but thinking about accountability. And punishment and accountability are two entirely different things, right?
exactly.
Accountability can be liberating. Accountability can be empowering, right? Holding yourself accountable and being in community with people who will hold you accountable, right? Being able to admit that you made a mistake, that you went wrong, that you hurt someone, and saying that I can do better and I will do better, right? And extending that grace to other people, right? Saying that, you know, you did such and such, or you said such and such, but you can do better, right?
Mm,
Because you are better, and that doesn't define you. we're not going to take the penalistic approach to this. We're not going to try to punish you, right? This is not retributive justice. This is restorative justice. And how do we practice that in our everyday relationships, right?
Exactly.
I think that's very, very important. And I think that you're really tested on that stuff on places like Twitter when you see someone post like a dumbass tweet.
but to be fair, I know we're tested on Twitter, but at the same time, do you not just feel like Twitter is the jungle though? Before
Yeah, yeah.
I used to feel like, oh, let me be a bit respectable on Twitter, but I thought, nah, fuck it. It's
Yeah.
actually the jungle. It's the jungle.
Yeah. Honestly, it's a different world out there. It's like it's not real life, and in real life, we're much different. Or at least
Exactly.
I hope people are different. At least for me, it's case by case, bro. I've quote unquote been harassed on Twitter and dragged on Twitter sometimes for my takes, and I feel like it's a misunderstanding or a misreading of something I said, and like it makes me wish that these people extended some grace to me. So I try to extend that grace to others. And look, I'll be honest. You go through my timeline, you'll see places where I've slipped up. Like
Yeah.
I'm not like, and that's the thing. Like I don't hide it. I'm not pretending to be like the saintly figure, right? Embracing that imperfection and saying that I'm a work in progress is important. And I think it's important for organizing. It's important for movement building. It's important, really, if we want to, create the world that we wish to see. This is how we do it, man. This is my approach, not just to politics, bro. It's also my approach to religion. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Like imposing is not going to convince people. Shaming is not going to convince people. Like berating is not going to convince people. It just does not work, man. Nobody. If you are a negative nanny, you're constantly talking down on this group or that group. Nobody wants to be around you. Nobody wants to talk to you. Nobody wants to hear from you, whether it's political or religious or anything else, right?
For real.
Like nobody likes that.
No, exactly. And I feel like as well, and this is why it's not about, obviously you don't want to create, a cult of personality worship around yourself and stuff. But again, it's important to have a personality. And I think this is I remember being at some point just myself trying to like, let me not be myself online. Let me be a bit like, I'm thinking, nah, why am I so calculated for?
Yeah.
I mean, again, you can be strategic in terms of how you organize, but in terms of how you portray yourself. I know it sounds again, this might not be the best way to get people to adopt revolutionary politic, but how many times have I heard people say, I adopted this way of thinking, or the catalyst of this way of thinking was literally I heard a speech by Malcolm X and I fell in love with the man. You know what I mean? So, and I think that's equally as valid. As it's not so much how you start, it's where you end up and what your trajectory is. I do want to throw a little final point because I don't really have. I mean, not that I have to cut it off, but I normally run my podcast about this length. But I have one question for you because as someone who studies Islamic studies, but also involved in the leftist spaces, I do get a lot of questions from young Muslims who speak about this dilemma they face with, let's say, quote unquote activism or leftist spaces and the problem it presents to aspects of their faith they might seem. And not the aspects where you might think, oh, there's like an antagonistic relationship between some leftists and some leftist ideology and Islam. That's a whole something else. But I'm talking about, let's say, I hate to do this because it's this nonsense culture war that has been fueled and also practiced and carried out by, unfortunately, many Muslim figures as well. But the whole thing of, let's say, the LGBTQ movement, and the pronouns in the bio, and I get questions a lot from young Muslims saying, "Oh, I want to be an activist, but I find this thing, it not prevents me from organizing, but it presents to me a dilemma because I don't believe my faith allows me to believe that way of life or those practices or those things should be condoned." So I'm going to ask you, sorry, as a curveball, innit? Sorry, but I do want to get your thoughts.
No, it's all good. These are questions that, you have to grapple with if you're involved in any faith-based community or any community that might define itself as traditional, and you're in the world, right? You're engaging in the world, and you can't, unless you're living in a gated community, you're going to have to engage with these topics, right? Issues about gender and sexuality are not unique to Muslims, right?
Yeah.
There are communities, Jewish communities, Christian communities, they're also facing these issues. So like the first thing I would tell this person is that you are not the first person to ask this question or to engage with this dilemma, nor will you be the last. These are questions that, people are still grappling with and still figuring out. My first thing is, there's nothing in your faith that prevents you from affirming the humanity of somebody and fighting for their dignity, regardless
Yes.
what their gender, their sexuality, their religion, whatever way of life that they are living, your faith calls you to affirm that their inherent worth, right?
Yes.
And that in itself should be enough of a reason for you, when there is homophobic violence,
Mm-hmm.
being meted out on someone, you should be able to say that this is unacceptable. I
Yes.
as a Muslim cannot accept this, right? I
Yes.
cannot accept this demonization of a community or of a people,
Yeah.
right? I'm not a jurist, I'm not a theologian, so I can't touch the theology or the law. However, I can say that our faith, regardless of what theological school you belong to, calls you to these things, calls you to be just, and calls you to be fair, and calls you
Mm-hmm.
to defend the rights of people as best as you can, right? The other thing I would add is that, like, historically, Islamic societies have been very pluralistic and very embracing, of a wide array of differences, and a lot of the siloing into various boxes is a result of colonial modernity. And so, you've had people in pre-modern Islamic societies that one might describe as queer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And by that I don't just mean in terms of sexuality, but I also mean in terms of religious beliefs, ideas, a lot of syncretism that existed. Now that doesn't mean that it was all acceptable to quote unquote orthodoxy, but
Yes.
it existed, right? There was a space for it, right? And I think that counts for something, right? Like,
Absolutely.
you've had, and Mama, this is stuff you've studied too, so everything I'm saying you already know, right? Like, you've had these very idiosyncratic, expressions of faith
Mm-hmm.
existing alongside what one might call orthodox or normative expressions, right?
Yes.
Existing side by side, without worrying about state violence being meted out on them.
Yes.
And every human being deserves that safety. Every human being deserves that dignity. So,
100%.
if someone asks you these questions, you tell them, your starting point is the inherent dignity and humanity of all people, right?
Yes.
You know, Muslim, Jew, gay, straight, black, white. It's the inherent dignity of all human beings that our faith
Yeah.
calls us to, and that is our starting point, right? Everything else is our details,
Yeah.
and so that's how I would kind of grapple with the question.
Thank you so much, man. I mean, we could go on forever, and I'm sure I'm going to have to invite you on again because we have so much more to talk about. But I'm in kind of conscious of time, and I kind of noticed that after a certain amount of time, people don't listen to long podcasts. I try to keep it as short as possible, but informative. This has been a very, very informative conversation. I will leave Asad's social media in the description of this episode. Please feel free to hit him up. He is someone that can be, reached out to, ask questions of, and he's a great resource as well. So until next time, you are listening to the Malcolm Effect with Mamadou. Please like, comment, subscribe, and until next time.